Air travel has always been about progress, pushing the boundaries of science and physics to connect people across the globe. Yet, alongside incredible advancements in safety and technology, there have been moments of unimaginable horror that have forever changed the way we think about travelling by air. 9/11 is one of those defining moments, and the crash of Pacific Southwest Airlines 1771 is another. David Augustus Burke was born on the 18th of May 1952 in Great Britain. His parents were Jamaican immigrants who worked hard to give their kids a better life. When David was 6, the family made the tough decision to emigrate once again, this time to chase the American dream. They settled on the East Coast in Rochester, New York. David was known as a talkative guy who enjoyed socializing and making connections. Friends and family described him as someone who could be charming and charismatic and was always ready with a story or a joke. But beneath his outgoing personality, there were signs of a temper, and he had a tendency to hold grudges. Those close to him noticed he could be unpredictable, and he would go through long periods of deep frustration and anger, especially when he felt like someone had wronged or offended him. But there was one thing about David which was always consistent. He loved women. He never married, but he did father 7 children to 4 different mothers. Despite his trouble keeping those relationships together, David was a devoted father. He made sure to always keep to his scheduled visits, and when his ex-partners needed him to step in for extra time, he always agreed. Friends recall that he was a cheerful and generous man, the kind of person who would give the shirt off his back to someone in need. Ever since David's family had moved to the USA, his father worked as a taxi driver out of Greater Rochester Airport. So when David finished high school and began looking for his first job, the natural place to apply was the same airport that his dad knew so well. In the 1970s, David began working for US Air, which is now known as US Airways. This was the parent company of Pacific Southwest Airlines. PSA was a popular airline in the US, and it was well known for its scantily clad cabin crew and heavily discounted flights. Some routes were only $10. As an employee, David held various terminal-based roles, and he eventually worked as a ticketing agent at Greater Rochester Airport. With 7 kids to support, David also had various side hustles over the years to top up his regular full-time salary. He owned a truck which had a snowplow on front, he invested in real estate, and he fixed up cars for friends who paid him in cash. Whenever he could, David would use his airline staff privileges to fly one or more of his kids to visit his parents, or just to take a return flight somewhere so they could experience the joy of flying. But things started changing for David in July 1987. By then, he had been employed by US Air for nearly 15 years. He had worked hard and put in extra effort to put himself in the best position for a promotion to customer service supervisor. But his application was declined, and the job was given to one of his colleagues instead. A week later, David filed a discrimination complaint against his employer. He argued that he had been overlooked because of his race as a black man. The person who got the job was a white woman. At the time of the complaint, David was working from Greater Rochester International Airport. The discrimination claim was unsuccessful, and as a result, David was transferred to work at Los Angeles Airport. Just a couple of months later, in 1987, David's manager Raymond Thompson began to suspect that he was stealing money from flight cocktail receipts. This is the cash which is collected from passengers who buy drinks mid-flight. Raymond set up a hidden camera which caught David in the act of stealing $69, or about $200 in today's money. On the 19th of November, David was put on unpaid leave pending an investigation. He told his girlfriend and the mother of 3 of his children that he had been fired without cause and that he was going to make the company pay for getting rid of him. At a hearing on Monday the 7th of December, David pleaded for leniency. He said that he was innocent and that he had no reason to steal from the airline. He also claimed that his supervisor was out to get him after he made the discrimination complaint, and that ever since he had been put on unpaid leave, he was struggling to pay the bills for his 7 children. On top of that, David had also booked 3 of his kids on a flight for Christmas using his staff privileges, and if he got fired, he would have to let them down as he wouldn't be able to afford to pay for the flights. Ultimately, David's plea fell on deaf ears, and he was dismissed from his job without notice. It was only later that the airline disclosed they were concerned he had taken much more than $69. They believed he had stolen thousands of dollars in cash, but that wasn't the worst of it. The airline bosses also believed David was using his position at the terminal to help cocaine smugglers get into the country. The reason for this suspicion was the fact that 3 years earlier, David had been investigated by the local police and FBI on suspicion of drug trafficking and auto theft. However, the only crime David had ever been charged with was in 1984, when he was charged with petty larceny after being arrested for shoplifting $45 worth of goods from a local store. David pleaded guilty to a lesser charge of disorderly conduct, and he didn't serve any time in jail. A year later, in 1985, David's name came up on a confidential wiretap which had been recorded in a major drug investigation being led by the FBI. The task force eventually indicted 24 people for allegedly trafficking hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of marijuana and cocaine from Jamaica through Rochester Airport. According to officials, David wasn't a target of the investigation, even though he had been named by their confidential informants. Those informants said David was the person who used his airport contacts to help them move the drugs. David was never charged in relation to this investigation. Regardless, airline bosses didn't want David to be employed with them anymore. After being informed that he was fired, David was marched out the front door of the US Air offices in LA. Before the door shut behind him, the person told David to have a nice day. He replied, quote, "I intend on having a very good day," end quote. After leaving the offices, David returned to the terminal and purchased a one-way ticket on PSA Flight 1771 from LAX to San Francisco. The plane was a 3-year-old British Aerospace BAE 146-200, which is a 4-engine jetliner. David chose that specific flight because he knew that his boss commuted to LA from his home in San Francisco every day, and this was the flight he took to get home. Once David had taken his seat on the plane, he pulled out a paper air sickness bag and wrote, quote, "Hi Ray, I think it's sort of ironical that we ended up like this. I asked for some leniency for my family. Remember? Well, I got none, and you'll get none." End quote. Flight 1771 left LAX on schedule at 3:30 p.m. It was due to land at SFO at 4:43 p.m. But at 4:16 p.m., the plane nosedived into the side of a hill on the Santa Rita cattle ranch. The ranch is located in Paso Robles in San Luis Obispo County. It hit the earth at approximately 770 miles per hour, or 1,240 kilometers per hour. The force at the site of impact was 5,000 times the force of gravity. It just so happened that at the time of the crash, a news helicopter was in the vicinity of the area. The pilot of the helicopter was able to immediately notify authorities of the location of the crash site, and emergency services raced to the scene. But as they arrived, it became clear there would be no survivors. It might surprise you to learn that the crater caused by such an impact was less than 2 feet deep and 4 feet across. There were 43 passengers on Flight 1771. All of them died on impact. Within hours of the crash, a team of 100 searchers descended on the area. There was very little identifiable wreckage, seeing as the plane had impacted the ground with so much force. When it was clear there were no survivors, the area was cordoned off and the investigation into the cause of the crash began. But this was no easy task. The area surrounding the crash site was steep and rocky, and the weather only made matters worse. By noon of the day after the crash, heavy rain had turned the scene into a swamp, and investigators became concerned that if searchers kept trampling over the area, they would damage critical evidence. When the weather cleared, the area was taped into a large grid so that every piece of evidence could be recorded to identify where it came from. This is critical data in an airplane crash, as it can indicate the sequence of events that occurred during the crash, the impact forces, and potential points of failure in the aircraft. By carefully mapping out debris and wreckage, investigators can determine how the aircraft broke apart, where specific components ended up, and whether there were any signs of an in-flight explosion or structural failure. One by one, the pieces of wreckage and human remains were removed from the site and transported to a temporary morgue. Witnesses who ran to the site of the crash said none of the human remains were any larger than the size of a hand. At a press conference in the following days, the vice chairman of the National Transport Safety Board, who were responsible for identifying the cause of the crash, stated that the largest piece of wreckage was only a couple of feet long. The flight data recorder, which is commonly known as the black box, was found and recovered from the crash site. However, it was badly damaged, and only some information was able to be retrieved. However, the cockpit voice recorder was completely intact. It didn't take long for crash investigators to suspect foul play. First of all, witnesses on the ground reported hearing a tremendous booming sound just before the impact. This was the sound of the aircraft breaking the noise barrier. Those witnesses also saw the plane fly at an approximate 70-degree angle directly into the earth. This indicated that the plane had hit the ground in one piece, which wouldn't have happened if the plane had exploded in the air, like what you might expect to happen if there was a catastrophic malfunction on the aircraft. It's important to note that weather on the day was clear and there was no wind. On top of the evidence from the site, there were also reports of a Mayday call having come in from the pilots of PSA Flight 1771. Just moments before the plane began to nosedive, the pilots of the flight were discussing turbulence with air traffic control. In the background is the sound of the toilet door opening and closing, and two distinct popping noises could be heard. Immediately after, the pilot broadcast a mayday over the radio and reported that there was gunfire on board. At the same time, the pilot activated a secret cockpit distress signal which flashed to air traffic controllers. But these warnings came too late. Moments after the mayday was sent out, came the sound of the cockpit door opening. A female voice, which likely belonged to a flight attendant, told the pilots, quote, "We have a problem," end quote. The captain replied to her, quote, "What kind of problem?" end quote. There was a popping sound, and then the voice of a man said, quote, "I'm the problem," end quote. There were two more pops. After that, radio silence, and then impact. The time between the Mayday call and the plane descending into a nosedive was just 25 seconds. Investigators believe the first 2 pops were the sounds of Raymond Thompson being shot. Those final 3 pops were the sound of the female flight attendant and both pilots on board the aircraft being shot. There are 2 theories about what happened next. Either the slumped over bodies of the pilots pushed the columns forward and sent the plane into a nosedive, or whoever killed the pilots pushed the column as far forward as they could intentionally. Both scenarios had the same outcome. The nose of the aircraft was pitched down, which sent it speeding directly towards the earth. In those final few seconds before the impact, the voice recorder captured the sound of the wind whipping past the windscreen as the aircraft increased in speed. Then there was one final pop and a long silence. Some people believe this is the sound of PSA's chief pilot being shot. He was on board Flight 1771 as a passenger, and those who knew him believe he may have tried to reach the cockpit to save the aircraft. Others claim that the final pop was the sound of the hijacker shooting himself. During a press conference in late December, investigators revealed the chilling details of what they believe had occurred on Flight 1771. The FBI and the NTSB announced that the crash was not a tragic accident, it had been intentional, and they identified a suspect, 35-year-old David Burke. The story about the disgruntled employee who took a devastating path for revenge came as a shock to the aviation community and the entire nation. It was hard to comprehend that a simple grievance over a job loss could spiral into such a horrific act. Investigators were clear that this was a premeditated act of terror which was driven by anger and resentment. But even with all of the evidence, it was impossible to connect how David went from pissed off at his boss to using an aircraft filled with innocent passengers as a weapon for his personal vendetta. But the evidence to indicate that is exactly what happened was conclusive. Even though the plane and all of its passengers were basically obliterated on impact, there was still plenty of physical evidence collected from the scene. I don't understand physics enough to know how 43 people and a whole plane dissolved at the second of impact, while certain pieces of evidence were left completely intact. For example, it was revealed in a TV documentary that after 2 days of digging in the dirt at the crash site, the NTSB recovered 6 empty bullet casings, as well as the .44 Magnum revolver David Burke used in the hijacking. On top of this, a fragment of his fingertip was recovered from inside the weapon's trigger guard. There was enough left of his finger for a fingerprint to be taken, which confirmed David as the shooter. The NTSB believe this proves David was alive and holding the gun until impact, which adds more weight to the theory that the final pop came from David shooting PSA's chief pilot. As for the gun itself, a friend and colleague of David later admitted that he had lent him the weapon as well as 12 rounds of ammunition. You might be able to understand how a gun survived the crash, but what about the paper bag which had the note to Raymond written on it? You might have been thinking, how did they know about this note? Well, even though all those pieces of metal were vaporized, the paper sick bag David had written on was recovered intact. According to the documentary I mentioned earlier, the impact compressed the soil on the side of the mountain. And according to physics experts, that soil almost immediately rebounded, which threw fragments of the plane and its contents back into the air. This caused a fire, which consumed a lot of that airborne debris, but not the paper bag. There was also other evidence, such as the discovery of 2 bullet holes in the fragments of a passenger seat. Another bullet hole was found in a seat, which was able to be identified as being from one of the flight crew. This is likely where David's boss was sitting during the flight. The largest individual pieces of human remains from Flight 1771 were several feet which were found intact inside shoes. So investigators had the gun, they had the bullets, and they had the bullet holes in the seats, which confirmed that the sounds on the voice recorder were indeed gunshots. But that begged the question, how did David get the weapon on the plane in the first place? As part of the investigation, employees of the airline were questioned about terminal security. It turns out that even though this crash occurred before 9/11, which of course changed airport security forever, David should have had to go through a metal detector before boarding his flight. But because he still had his staff credentials and he was familiar to ground crew, he was able to bypass security completely. Basically, he walked straight onto the plane carrying a loaded .44 Magnum revolver and at least 6 rounds of ammunition. With this information, the airline was forced to reveal that their policy was to allow uniformed employees with identification badges to avoid airport metal detectors completely. Investigators also spoke to David's girlfriend, who was an employee of US Air as well. She revealed that she had received a voicemail from David just a few minutes before the flight took off. He said, quote, "I'm on my way to San Francisco, flight 1771. I love you. I really wish I could say more, but I do love you." End quote. She also disclosed that ever since David had been put on unpaid leave, he had become moody and violent. Just 3 days before he was fired for good, he forced her and her daughter into his vehicle. Then he made her drive more than 6 hours at gunpoint. This incident was not reported to the police. The FBI report into the crash also revealed that David purchased 2 life insurance policies, one for $195,000 and one for $100,000. And get this, he bought them both at an insurance counter inside the terminal at LAX on the day of the flight he intended to crash. When the NTSB and FBI released their report, they determined that the cause of the crash was a combination of inadequate airport security and operating procedures, along with intentional sabotage. In other words, the crash and deaths of 43 people was entirely preventable. David may have had every right to be disgruntled at US Air. Maybe he was innocent of the theft accusations, maybe the airline didn't follow due process, and maybe they hadn't treated him fairly when it came to investigating the theft claims. What he didn't have was the right to take 43 people down with him on his quest for revenge. I'm now going to read the names of all of the passengers and crew of Flight 1771. Captain Greg Lindemood, First Officer James Howard Nunn, Flight Attendant Debbie Nissen-Neal, Flight Attendant Deborah Volsteck, Flight Attendant Trainee Julie Gottesman. Julie was the youngest passenger on this flight. The passengers included Sean Addington, Jim Carroll, Stephen Cohn, John Conte, Anthony Cordova, Sharon Engstrom, Karen Fox, Donald Hogue, Teresa Kekai, Jocelyn Kempe, Karen Crom, Kathleen Meeker, Owen Murphy, Wayne Nelson, Cliff Perry, Kevin Phelan, Thomas Rabin, Curtis Ree, John Rosine, Bill Rosenberg, B. Sauer, E. Sauer, Camille Scaffire, Kirk Sheba, Alan Swanson, James Siller, Ray Thompson, Earl Webb Jr., Mary Webb, Neil Webb, and Leon Winters. In the days after the tragedy, a mass non-denominational memorial service was held 20 miles south of the crash site. More than 125 family members of those on board the flight gathered, as well as 50 representatives from Pacific Southwest Airlines. Those who died on Flight 1771 are memorialized at the site with a single marble headstone which reads, "In memory of those who perished in the airplane crash of PSA Flight 1771. 6 passengers on board the flight had no physical remains and were never able to be positively identified. Their families have requested that their names not be released." Among those killed was James Siller, who was the president of Chevron USA. He was traveling with 3 of the firm's public affairs executives. 3 executives of Pacific Bell were also killed in the crash. This incident led to many corporate policies which limit the number of executive-level personnel who can travel on the same flight. As a result of David's actions, strict federal laws were passed which include a law that requires immediate seizure of all airline employee credentials upon termination from an airline position. Another policy that was put into place, and which you'll notice today when you travel through the airport, is that all members of any airline flight crew, including the captain, must be subjected to the same security measures as passengers. The crash of Pacific Southwest Airlines Flight 1771 is one of those defining moments that forever changed air travel. While 9/11 led to sweeping changes in global security protocols, Flight 1771 highlighted the dangers that can arise from threats much closer to home.